The Miami Dolphins face kind of a make it or break it 2015 season with the New England Patriots and their whole Deflategate thing, potentially a suspension of Tom Brady for 4 games or maybe even less, but still potentially a couple of games. The Dolphins are potentially in a position to where they could have a shot at winning the division in 2015, or major changes could happen in the organization. So it wasn't that surprising to see them try to make a big splashy move in the offseason, which is what they did when they signed Ndamukong Suh in free agency away from the Detroit Lions. Now you take that and combine it with the fact that they were active in the trade market by trading away Mike Wallace, trading for Kenny Stills, and most recently re-signing Ryan Tannehill to a long-term deal, making a statement that he's their franchise quarterback and he's their guy. It was easy to see that with the 2015 NFL Draft, the Miami Dolphins were going to focus on 2 things. They were going to focus on building around their big quarterback on offense, Ryan Tannehill, their franchise guy, and they were going to focus on building around their new star on defense, their difference maker in Ndamukong Suh. And that's what they should do, and that's in this draft what they set out to do, and that somewhat is pretty much the philosophy that they followed. They went about trying to get help for Ryan Tannehill and get some help for Ndamukong Suh on the defensive side of the ball, some pieces that could be successful around them. And you look at what they did on the offensive side of the ball. You're talking about drafting DeVante Parker with the 14th overall pick, a potential #1 wide receiver with size and big playability, just the type of guy that a Ryan Tannehill needs. You're talking about trading away a 3rd-round pick for an established deep threat like a Kenny Stills, getting him away from the Saints, spending a 4th-round pick on another offensive lineman like a Jamil Douglas from Louisville. In the 5th round, taking a flyer gamble pick on a guy who could end up outplaying his draft position, a guy that was viewed by many, myself included, to be a 2nd to 3rd round prospect in this draft in Ajayi, the running back from Boise State. They went about trying to help out Ryan Tannehill, getting him some playmakers, especially on the offensive side of the ball. But then again, they focused on the defensive side of the ball as well, drafting a big nose tackle like Jordan Phillips to potentially play opposite Ndamukong Suh on the inside. That's a very beefy interior of the Dolphins in defensive line in theory. Then spending 3 5th-round picks on defensive backs, Bobby McCain from Memphis and Cedric Thompson from Minnesota, and Tony Lippett, the wide receiver / corner from Michigan State, who I would anticipate will flip over to corner full-time at the NFL level. So I could see the philosophy and how it played out, and the Dolphins stuck to that philosophy and to that game plan. Now, in terms of their best pick, I think by far it was DeVante Parker. There was some thought by me especially that the Dolphins could be one of those teams looking to perhaps even trade up into the top 10 to go get somebody. Some thought maybe a Kevin White, but I thought maybe more so a Todd Gurley. And I was surprised that they didn't, but the way the draft board broke down for them, it worked perfectly because they needed somebody like a DeVante Parker. He was arguably best player available on the board at that time, filled a big position of need, just made too much freaking sense not to do it. And now the Dolphins got their #1 wide receiver that they didn't have for their young quarterback, Ryan Tannehill. Now you take him and you pair him with a Jarvis Landry, a Kenny Stills, a hopefully healthy Jordan Cameron, and you're talking about a backfield with a Lamar Miller and perhaps somebody like a Ajayi. Now Ryan Tannehill has some nice weapons to work with on the offensive side of the ball, and maybe they can give it a go in the division in 2015. A guy that could surprise, I do think, is Ajayi. I understand there were a lot of concerns about a bulky knee, but this is a guy that is a 3-down back at the NFL level, in my opinion, and I think could end up being a real steal for the Dolphins. While I like Lamar Miller, I think Ajayi potentially has more long-term upside. At worst, he ends up being a nice complement 1-2 combination with Lamar Miller, but I think Ajayi could be a guy that outplays his draft position. In terms of things that I second-guess, I do somewhat second-guess spending a 3rd-rounder via trade on a guy like Kenny Stills. Here's a guy with already 2 years under his belt. He's had some injury problems. There's some concerns perhaps about how he is in the locker room. And with another pretty good wide receiver class, in particular with the type of talents that a Kenny still has, there are a lot of guys in this draft that were available at some point in time for the Dolphins to take. Why not take a guy that's younger and maybe invest the same or less draft pick and get him within your own system for day #1? I'm just not sure they had to spend a 3rd-round pick in a trade to go get a guy like Kenny Stills when I thought there were other guys like Kenny Stills in this draft. What really surprised me, though, was absolutely no attention paid to the linebacking position. I think many Dolphins fans would agree that the biggest weakness on that defense for years has been their linebacking core. It's been bad, it's been terrible, it's been brutal. Failed draft picks like DeAndre Jordan and Koamisi, failed free agents, just it's been a gaping void, and at no point in time did they address that. And while sure, an Ndamukong Suh may potentially help that in some ways, you still got to have somebody that can play back there, and I just don't know that the Dolphins have anybody that can play in that linebacking core. Now, overall, I love the DeVante Parker pick for the Dolphins at number 14. Tannehill gets his number 1 wide receiver that Mike Wallace never was. You need a number 1 wide receiver for a young quarterback to reach his full potential. And again, I think Ryan Tannehill is just scratching the surface of his potential of what he can be. Now, hopefully, he becomes more confident and more willing to take chances down the field. That's one knock I've had about him in his first 3 years as a pro. And a guy like DeVante Parker hopefully will help him shape that a little bit. I love that pick. It just made so much sense. The Dolphins didn't have to get cute. They didn't have to move up. They didn't move down. He was just there, and they took him. Phillips in round 2 makes some sense to me in the sense that, if he's the type of athlete that you think he is, with a combination of size, strength, and short area explosiveness, he could be a real problem opposite Ndamukong Suh, and he could make it harder to double and triple team Ndamukong Suh. Could open up things outside for the edge rushers like Wake and Vernon. However, I'm just wondering if that really needed to be the pick in round number 2. Maybe, just maybe, with the fact that they didn't address linebacker, instead of trading back from where they were in round 2, allowing the Eagles to get up and take Eric Rowe. Maybe they should have just taken Eric Rowe, or they should have just stayed put and addressed inside linebacker with a guy like Denzel Perryman from the U. Would have made a lot of sense to me. Phillips makes some sense. I understand it to a degree. But at that point in time, maybe they should have taken Eric Rowe if they stayed put, or a Denzel Perryman, especially if they stayed put. Or even if they traded back, maybe somebody like an Owa Odigizua, because Wake's not the youngest player. They could have used another young edge rusher to basically make up for the mistake that has been Deion Jordan. It's just a thought. Now, I do like the fact that they got multiple pieces on the offensive side of the ball to help Ryan Tannehill. That's key, and that's how it should be done. He's your franchise player, and even with the signing of Ndamukong Suh, you were ultimately only going to swim as far as Ryan Tannehill can doggy paddle you, so to speak. So it was important for them to devote a lot of their efforts to the offensive side of the ball, which is what they did. So this draft for the Dolphins, I go back and forth between a B- and a C+. I like the philosophy. I like some of the execution. There are some concerns I have, most especially, though, the fact that they didn't address linebacker at any point in time. Not the greatest linebacker class, but where they were sitting, especially in round number 2, they still could have gotten somebody like a Denzel Perryman, who could have had an impact in the middle, especially with a guy like Ndamukong Suh in front of him, keeping blockers off of him. It was still a solid draft for the Miami Dolphins. A guy like DeVante Parker is obviously, I think, going to make a big impact. Kenny Stills, when you factor that trade in, he'll have some impact as a down-the-field threat. It was a good, solid draft for the Miami Dolphins. It most certainly doesn't hurt them in their quest to try and contend in the AFC East in 2015, that's for sure.